Hi. So this video is called Triggered, and we're going to talk, well, I guess all about triggers. We're going to talk about what a trigger actually is. As always, we're going to put a little bit of science in there to explain why you might experience triggers. And also we're going to talk about the fact that, like trauma response, triggers don't just disappear. There is no kind of end point on when somebody experiences triggers. But that doesn't mean that a person will be traumatized forever. It doesn't mean that triggers will be a dominating part of your life and one that, ruins your day whenever you're feeling about being triggered. But it is important to normalize that, like everything else in our life, our experiences, our memories are re-triggered by certain things in our life. And that's because we process and we reprocess our experiences all throughout our life. And that can sometimes make us feel differently about our experiences. We can remember different aspects of our experiences. And if I use sort of going to school as an example, if we take the idea that somebody really hated school when they were younger, they didn't understand why they had to go. But actually, when they're an adult and they're in the adult world with all of the stresses that come with that, they might look back at their school days and think, God, I wish I could go back to school. And actually, it was great and I didn't really have that many responsibilities. So actually, as we experience new things in life, it can make us reflect on our previous experiences and think about them slightly differently. But when it comes to a traumatic experience, that also means that lots of things that we go through in life can make that experience come back up to the surface, and it can remind us of certain things that we felt at the time, certain aspects of the experience. And although that might sound really scary, the good news is that with knowledge and time, there are ways to manage those triggers. And so we do have a series of tactic videos on the website, and we've created lots of different types of videos that go through a range of different ways that might help you to manage the triggers themselves, but also to think about managing any unwanted consequences that come from experiencing triggers. But in this video specifically, what I'm really aiming to do is to hopefully empower you to learn more about your triggers, to learn more about why you experience them, and possibly even to identify what some of your current triggers are, and maybe some of the things that might become a trigger in the future, so that you feel better prepared and a little bit more in control of your experience of triggers. So what actually is a trigger? So a trigger is basically just a word for something that invokes a response. And in this particular context, a trigger can be absolutely anything in your environment, wherever you are, that reminds you of any aspect of your experience. And often that influences a response. And typically that isn't always a pleasant response. And it can be a physical response. So there might be something that reminds you of physically something that you felt in your body at the time. It might be an emotional response. So something might remind you of, some of the emotions that you felt during the experience or after. Or it might be something that reminds you of the way that you were thinking, the specific thoughts that you had during your experience or after. And you could experience all three of those things at the same time. So you could feel something really physical, you could feel intense emotion, and you could have really overwhelming and intrusive thoughts. But you may only experience one of those, and they don't necessarily follow a pattern. So you might find that something very specific made you feel something really strong in the pit of your stomach. And then the next day, you actually feel really scared and the physical feeling isn't there. That's completely normal. And There is no set way of responding to triggers. And although some people may find that there are patterns to their triggers, you also might not. They might feel completely random. You may be having an otherwise really great day, and suddenly something reminds you of your experience. And you might not be able to identify what that is. And that is also perfectly normal. And it's important to highlight that however you experience triggers, whatever the triggers are, they're unique to you, because what happened is unique to you. So, comparing maybe what triggers you compared to what triggers somebody else, or how they respond to their triggers, isn't necessarily helpful, because we will all respond completely differently. And so it's just important to reinforce that message that it is a really normal response to a truly horrible experience, and one that also doesn't reflect how well you're coping or how you feel about what's happened to you. So, why do we actually experience triggers? Well, like I mentioned earlier, we process and reprocess our experiences throughout our entire life. And that's because our experiences are stored as memories. So our brain holds all of our experiences as memories. And that means that these memories can be triggered. So they can be triggered by certain people, certain places, certain life events, and it can cause us to think about that experience. But when we think about a trauma, that experience is actually stored slightly differently, because our body almost stores trauma as a kind of live, lived experience. And so, what that means is that when we are reminded of that, our brain and our body, it sends signals to us that can often feel like we're experiencing it again. It can feel like it's happening right this second. And that's what we refer to as flashbacks. So you may have heard of flashbacks, and essentially they are a really vivid and intense experience that basically means the person experiencing it feels like they are going through something horrible all over again. Some people describe it as if they were kind of watching a movie, and that can play out in different ways depending on the person. Some people have described it to me as being in the movie, so they are almost experiencing it as if it were happening there and then. Whereas other people have described it as if they're sort of looking down on the scene and they're sort of watching the movie. And either one of those ways is perfectly normal, and there is no comparison. There's no right way to experience a flashback. And that means as well that although often the narrative in society around flashbacks is that they're this really visual experience, that's not always the case. Some people will not experience images. Some people will just experience really intense sensations, or they might experience certain thoughts that they had at the time. That's all okay. And it's really just worth noting that just because people describe something in a certain way doesn't mean that that's the only way that you can experience something. And when thinking about flashbacks, to some degree, experiencing flashbacks is part of the processing process. You will experience reminders of what's happened to you. But if you're feeling like the flashbacks are so intense, they're lasting, days, possibly even weeks, and they're really having a detrimental impact on how you want to live your life. That might be struggling to get out of bed in the morning, it might be not being able to go to work or university. If they are really impacting how you want to live your life, then you might want to check out our video around therapy explained, because it might be that you need maybe just a little bit more support than that these videos are able to offer. Although we want them to be super informative and supportive, they're not designed to be a replacement for therapy. So it might be worth just having a look into that video and maybe looking at some of our resources on the website around what to do if you feel like you need a little bit more support. Because we want this to be as helpful as it possibly can be. But that doesn't mean that there aren't other resources that you could use alongside these videos, particularly if you are struggling at the moment. If you've watched the Why Did I video, which is all about trauma response, we essentially summarize the fact that when our body and, brain detects any kind of danger, we put all of our resources into protecting ourselves. And actually that this pattern of protection lasts a lot longer than people perhaps talk about. And in that sense, it can really influence how we respond to triggers. Understandably, triggers can be a really awful experience, and actually it can make our protective instincts fire off, and that can lead us to develop ways to manage triggers, ways to protect ourselves from the triggers. So that might look like avoiding certain things, people, places. It might mean developing certain ways of coping with things to help reduce the emotional intensity and the unpleasantness of triggers. And we do have a video that talks all about coping strategies. But I just want to highlight in this video that however you are responding to triggers, even if that's a way that perhaps society might not approve of, or you may have received kind of blaming messages about, it's just really important to note that it's a protective response, and it's a really understandable response to protecting yourself from a trigger that is so unpleasant. And it makes sense that you would want to avoid that. So I just wanted to highlight that, because I think we've spoken about blaming messages and how impactful they can be and how they can really prevent us from healing at times. So it might be hard to absorb that message right now, and you might not kind of believe me, and that's okay. But I just want to reinforce that, triggers are a really, really difficult thing to experience, and however you choose to manage them is completely understandable. So triggers can be really powerful. They can evoke really intense responses in us that remind us of the experience itself. But it's also important to highlight that triggers don't just have to be about the actual event itself. Like trauma response, they can occur for a lot longer than the event itself. And basically, we can become triggered around any aspect relating to our experience. So that might be being reminded of how somebody responded when you first told them. It might be the first time that you tried to seek some help or support. It can relate to any aspect of your experience, and it doesn't just have to be what happened during the experience. And that itself is also a really normal trigger. But whether the triggers remind you of the event itself or some of the things that happened afterwards, knowing your triggers and being able to recognize what might become a trigger is really the first step in starting to overcome them and starting to navigate ways to manage them so that they have less of an impact on your day. And some triggers might seem really obvious. So it might be things like going to the place where it happened. But others might seem really random, like I've said before. And although there are certain things that can be identified as triggers, that lots of people experience, common triggers that are reported by people. This isn't an exhaustive list, and like everything else about you, it's unique. But it can be helpful to maybe be aware of some of the things that are reported as common triggers, because it might help you to identify some really specific things that may remind you of your experience in some way. So these triggers could include making new friends or starting a new relationship. It might be environments where you're expected to trust somebody and open up to somebody, and that might feel really difficult after an experience like you've experienced. And actually connecting with somebody can feel incredibly scary. And with the relationship specifically, there might be things relating to sexuality that become a trigger. Building intimacy with somebody again might be really scary. And not just within relationships, we know that we don't have to be in a relationship to explore our sexuality. So it might be certain environments where you're around people that perhaps are flirting. You may be on a night out, you may be, going to a party, whatever that situation is, anything that perhaps reminds you of times when you may have previously been sexual before, that can be a really understandable trigger. And expressing your sexuality in general might become quite triggering. It's really normal for people to perhaps want to hide aspects of their body, to not want to draw attention to themselves for whatever reason, because the idea of being perceived as, as a sexual person can be really overwhelming, and it can be perceived as a real threat. So that's definitely something that can become a trigger. And as well, certain places might become a trigger themselves, not just where something happened, but perhaps places where you might expect to see the person that's done this. If this is somebody who you know or who you are familiar with, particularly if this was in a workplace setting or university, you may be really frightened to go to your lectures, to go to that workplace, because you might see them. And even just the place itself can be a reminder for what happened. Things that maybe are less commonly talked about is things like medical procedures, going to the doctors, having to have certain examinations done. All of these things can be a trigger around what's happened, but also feeling vulnerable, exposing body parts, or even talking about your body can be a real trigger as well. For a lot of people, and this might be later in life, and this is another example, I suppose, of how triggers can occur for a really long time, is actually having children, or becoming pregnant. That can be a real trigger, not just, if you identify as female, actually the process of having a baby and all of the kind of bodily experiences that come with that, but actually becoming a parent. And this might remind you of the innocence perhaps that you had at the time, and how somebody could do that to a young person. All of these life experiences can come with really intense emotions, and they can lead us to reflect on our experience and perhaps even experience new emotions than what we did at the time. And that's a really normal thing, but it can be something that's really tricky to navigate. And so it's important to be aware that these things might be a trigger, and actually, how do I keep myself safe? How do I keep myself as healthy as I can be, and prepare myself for these feelings? And how do I perhaps use some of the supportive people in my bubble to help me through that as well. And another thing to highlight is that not just the person who's done this to you can be a trigger, but you may come across people who remind you of them. You may come across people who just for a second, you know, say something similar to what they did, or they have a certain look or body language or kind of tone of voice that reminds you of this person. That can be a really confusing thing because these people could potentially be, you know, close friends, even family members, but there could be something about them that in that moment reminds you of them. Or these people might be complete strangers and you may find yourself feeling really uneasy around certain people. And that also is a really common response to things. And you may also find yourself finding out certain things about the person themselves. You may find out that they've done this to somebody else. You may find out that they've actually been arrested. Anything relating to them. You may have mutual friends and you may see them crop up on any social media that you might have. You may find out that they're in a new relationship, you know, they themselves are having children. Anything like that can be a huge trigger and it can evoke really intense emotion in us. And although this list is not exhaustive, I hope there are certain things within that list that, you know, you're able to identify as potentially being something that you might experience or that you have experienced. And actually you can start to recognize some of the things that may cause you to feel triggered so that you can, I guess, put plans in place for some of these things. And I guess it's also important to highlight that although triggers can be very specific, so I've identified lots of kind of life events or specific places, specific things that you would have to go through. Triggers can also be less tangible than that. So it might be that all of a sudden you just have a really overwhelming fear of vulnerability, and that itself could become a trigger for how you felt at the time. So, you know, that could even be a presentation at university where you feel really exposed and in the spotlight. That feeling might resonate with how you felt at the time. And so feelings themselves can become a trigger. And sometimes they can be harder to recognize, and it can be harder to kind of pinpoint why you're feeling the way you're feeling. And so in that situation, you know, it might be helpful to kind of check in with yourself and question, what is it that I'm actually feeling right now? And have I felt like this before? Because sometimes that can, I guess, give us a little bit of a clue, particularly in our body as well. So because we store these experiences within our body, you know, we might experience certain sensations, or pains or discomfort, and actually questioning if we felt like that before, it can, I guess, act as a little bit of a roadmap to maybe some of the memories that are being triggered in that moment. And although triggers can be, and often are, a really overwhelming and unpleasant experience, being able to identify some of those triggers and really understand how you as an individual experience them is the first step in being able to take some control over them. You know, even just being able to predict a trigger might make you feel less out of control, and therefore perhaps that sense of threat might just be reduced a little bit so that you feel better prepared to manage it. And as I've mentioned, we do have a range of tactic videos, and we plan to add to these videos every couple of weeks. But what would be really great is if you're currently using any coping strategy that you find helpful in managing triggers, it would be great if you could share that with us. we want to learn from your expertise, and it might be really helpful to somebody else as well. So as always, I would really encourage you to get in touch if you have any ideas, and would like to share some of the skills that you've developed. That would be absolutely amazing. And again, I think this video has covered quite a bit of theory, I suppose, around triggers, and it's covered some examples of triggers, but as always, it's not an exhaustive list. So if there is anything else that you feel we've missed, or that you would like to know more about, or you feel actually this is a really big trigger for me and I think it's important that that's shared with other people, please get in touch, and I will try my very best to create some resources. That means that your voice is being heard, and we can continue to learn from each other.